Welcome to Marin Voices and Views. With Lawrence A. Strick, I'm Peter B. Collins. Our special guest today is California's Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, who is the top elections officer, among other duties. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Peter, thank you for having me. Larry, good to see you.
Good to see you again.
So I want to talk about elections. We're speaking just a few days before a momentous California primary. But before we get to that, give our viewers a quick overview of the Secretary of State's office, because you are the top elections officer and so much more.
Right, and thank you for asking, because when most people think of Secretary of State, they either think, wait a minute, I thought that was John Kerry. Mm-hmm. Very different Secretary of State at a state level versus federal. But the Secretary of State is more than just overseeing elections. And some fun responsibilities at that. If you look at my budget or number of personnel positions, the largest unit of the Secretary of State's office is actually the Business Programs Division, which handles millions of business filings each and every year. People establishing a company, limited partnerships, LLCs, even nonprofit organizations, maintaining your statements of information with the state. All those transactions are handled by our office. Another important division of the Secretary of State's office is called the Political Reform Division. Thanks to then Secretary of State Jerry Brown several decades ago, my office is charged with receiving financial reports from all state candidates and campaigns and making that information publicly available on our website. So it's an important transparency and accountability function, and so our office's website is where you go to for that information as well. And another, I think, fun and interesting responsibility, the very first law passed by the very first legislature in California charged the Secretary of State with maintaining and making publicly available all the historical records and documents of our state history. So I'm the custodian of the state's archives as well. But this being an election year, and even in non-election years, most people equate Secretary of State with overseeing elections, voter registration, everything that comes with that. So we certainly have our hands full right now.
Oh, you do. And we're speaking a few days before the June 7th primary election. Our viewers will see this afterward. So we don't know the outcome at this point, and you're still gearing up for massive participation. And your office even had to get extra funding from the legislature to deal with this wave. It was over 1 million, either new registrations or people who changed their registration in order to participate in the primary. And historically, California's primary hasn't mattered because it comes so far at the end of the cycle. So this is a big change for you in your first term as Secretary of State.
It is. Second year as Secretary, first election cycle as Secretary, and even deeper appreciation for the responsibility of the office. I think most of not just the state and the nation, most of the world knows this is an election year for us. And normally we see an increase in interest and activity in a presidential election cycle, more people registering, more people turning out to vote, both in June and in November. But the numbers that we're seeing this year so far are far and above a typical presidential year bump. To your point, just registration numbers alone, I can tell you that between January 1st and May 23rd this year alone, that was the registration cutoff, more than 1.8 million people came to our website, registertovote.ca.gov, to either register for the first time or to update their registration. It was more new registrants than updates, but even people updating their registration, their new address, or maybe modifying their political party affiliation, clearly an indicator of people getting ready to vote, people getting ready to participate in a very consequential June 7th primary. So that was a big sort of metric for us, red flag, that we have to be prepared. And if other states' primaries, including other states in the West, are any indicator, we could have turnout in June either at the 2008 level, which was a more recent high water mark, maybe even higher. And so we did go to the legislature and the governor and request supplemental funding just to make sure that resources was not an issue for all the 58 counties, making sure we're printing enough ballots, sending out voter information guides and sample ballots to all those new registered voters. By the way, that 1.8 million, that was just our website alone. separate and apart from DMV, the political campaigns, and the political parties, so that the true number could be significantly higher. We also want to make sure we have enough sufficient polling places, for example, where in other states you've seen consolidation of polling places and that leading to long lines and waits. We want to make sure that kind of stuff doesn't happen here in California.
Well, you took my first question right out from under me, which was voter turnout, which sounds great. Peter neglected to tell us how you got to be Secretary of State, though, and I want to backtrack a little bit. You got that post in 2014 after 2 terms as a California state senator from down south. I also want to tell the folks that you were on the City Council of Los Angeles, and you first got into this election business at age 26. Is that right?
Right. In the political, it's been quite the journey for me. Born and raised in the San Fernando Valley in Southern California, son of immigrants who came to the United States in the late 60s, met here actually, and got married, started a family. 25, 30 years later, finally went through the naturalization process and have never missed an election since they became citizens. But growing up as the son of a housekeeper and a short order cook, being in elected office was really the furthest thing from my mind. And as secretary now, one of the things that I do is try to visit as many high schools and college campuses as I can, trying to talk to young people about registering and about the importance of voting, and kind of sharing their cynicism sometimes about why does it matter? Does it really make a difference? Because I know that's what I thought growing up. It wasn't something that I could relate to. But going off to MIT, coming home with an engineering degree, thinking that was going to be my career path for the rest of my life, and life moved me in the direction of public service. So after a few years of being a staff member to some electeds and working on a couple of campaigns, I ran for city council in 1999, and 2 terms in the city council, 2 terms in the legislature, and here I am in a position where I can try to do something about that cynicism with young people.
Let's get back to the elections then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we're going to get back there.
It is a remarkable story.
It is a good story, and I didn't want it to go untold, and that's why I circled back. But with all the turnout that's expected, and it's remarkable because the last election had an abysmal turnout.
Right.
It was terrible. The networks we understand, have canceled their plans to do the exit polls for the June primary. And exit polls are a great way to confirm that the vote count. Did you know that what the decisions were behind that and why they might be doing that? No,
that was disappointing news when I learned about that. Unfortunately, the networks don't need my permission to conduct or not conduct those exit polls. And at the risk of being cynical, there's projections that the race will be over by the time the polls close in California, and this candidate versus that candidate and where they are in the delegate tallies, et cetera. But I do think there's a very important public service that's played through these exit polls. Not only kind of as one check against the final results, is it consistent or not, but I think even deeper to the extent that we can mine some of the data from exit polls about age breakdowns or gender breakdowns, geographic breakdowns, ethnic breakdowns, party breakdowns, and what's moving people to vote, not just in the presidential contest, but the United States Senate contest, congressional races, legislative races. They're all equally important for public policy and the future of California. And those exit polls sometimes let us kind of dig deeper into what the electorate's thinking, why people have chosen to vote, not just how they voted. And by contrast, it helps us understand the people who don't turn out to vote and how to better maybe engage them in future cycles. So it's disappointing that they canceled. We'll try to offset some of that with, I know some of the universities in California do some regional exit polling, so there's not a complete lack of information, but we'll try to encourage the networks to reinstate that in future cycles.
Mr. Secretary, in the primaries that have already occurred, the exit polls are pretty interesting in 2016 because on the Republican side, the announced vote count, the final tabulation, is within the margin of error on the Republican side in every primary. But in 11 out of 26 Democratic primaries, the variance is greater than the margin of error. And this suggests that there may have been some manipulation of the tabulation or other factors. I'm not making an indictment. I'm simply observing that the odds of the exit polls being wrong are astronomical. And yet we're seeing in 11 of 26 primaries, there has been a big gap there. What's your comment on that? And, without exit polls in California, do we have adequate checks to audit the result?
Right. No, and that's a good question. The engineer in me immediately thinks, well, we've got to look at the whole equation here. What are all the factors and variables in play, both on the election administration side, and the accountability and transparency of making sure it's an accurate count, but also on the exit polling side and what kind of methodology has been used. Because I've seen it, whether it's the polling of who's going to win on election day leading up to an election, as well as the exit polls on the back end of was the sample size big enough, or was the sample size diverse enough? So the 11 of the 26 states that might have gotten it wrong, I'd be curious as to which states those are. California is the biggest state by population and the most diverse state in the nation. And not all pollsters on the front end and exit pollers on the back end have the cultural competency sometimes, or the language range to capture true information from the electorate that's churning out. But and even then, that's assuming you know what the electorate looks like. A bump up, whether it's in the Asian community or the Latino community, or men versus women, or young voters who don't have a strong vote history versus seniors, etc. You have to make sure that the data pool reflects the electorate. And
it is fair to say that both Trump and Sanders have redefined the electorate for the respective parties.
Right, and from a small d democracy point of view, to the extent that there's new people, and that's what we're seeing here through the registration. If there's new people registering to become part of the process, that's great, regardless of the candidate that they're supporting. Or if people who may not be teenagers and cynical, but have sat it out for the better part of the last 10, 20 years, finally energized enough to participate in the election. That's good for democracy and I think public policy down the road, but it does make it tougher for political consultants to try to measure and try to keep the thumb on it.
There's some confusion for the voters too. Trump and Sanders have complained about the closed primaries and limiting voters here in California. And it's a little bit confusing because Republicans have a closed primary.
For president.
For president,
Yes.
I'm sorry. Right, for president, I'm sorry. The Democrats decline to state or no preference voters to request a ballot to vote. And that surprises people who are voting by mail because there's another issue. Do you support some reforms to clarify that for everyone so people are voting at the same time, or is that just a party issue that you have no control over?
No, I think it's a combination. I mean, if the competitiveness of the presidential contest on both sides of the aisle this cycle has done anything, it's also brought to light what the rules are, right, and how they're different from state to state. In some states, it's closed primaries for both parties. In some states, it's for one. For some states, it's open. Independents have a lot more latitude to vote for a candidate of their choice. It's kind of a parallel to how not everybody understands the electoral college process in November in determining who the ultimate winner is for the race for the White House. In California, it's also just a little bit different. Republican Party has chosen a closed primary system. The Democratic Party does allow for crossover voting for no party preference voters only in the Democratic primary. So the parties do have their say, which in California has inserted, I wouldn't say confusion, but the need to make sure voters are informed, because we've quickly have gotten used to this top two vote getter system for all other races, for U.S. Senate, for Congress, for legislature. Anybody can vote for anybody. The top two vote getters advance to November, regardless of political party. That was a great reform that I and my legislative colleagues supported in years past, and I think that's been good for the political climate in California. But to remind people that those rules don't apply to the presidential, I think it's begged the question of why the parties made the decisions that they did, and just a reminder that, hey, the people are the ones that influence what those rules are. So people who like those rules, they may be happy. People who don't like those rules, there's the party infrastructure that they have to influence to try to change that.
There's a new poll from the Associated Press that shows that 40% of the people they asked believe that the two-party system is broken. And, just by the metrics, Democrats and Republicans have 30% or less of the national registration. And so they're really minor parties. They're not a majority. And it is the independents, we call them no party preference in California, who really comprise the biggest group. So is this trending to the point where you see the two so-called major parties fading, and will we end up with a kind of multi-party approach going forward?
Well, I think it could be either a multi-party approach or maybe a redefined Republican Party, Democratic Party compared to what we've known for the last generation. A couple of bellwether states on this are, Florida, for example, where I see the biggest percentage of new folks registering being in that category that you just described. In California, this trend has been here for more than a decade now. Democrats have kind of held relatively flat as the top vote group amongst registered voters in California. Republicans have been on a slow decline now for a couple of decades, and what we used to call decline to state, now called no party preference, being the group that's rising. Mm-hmm. And they're still a few 100,000 away from catching the Republican Party for the second biggest group of voters in California. But it doesn't surprise me. When I do public events at these colleges and community groups and even high schools, by day my secretary hat is very, very neutral, very by the book. So I don't try to sway people one way or the other in terms of checking a political box. And young people, they'll ask me, what does this party stand for, that party stand for, this party stand for? And it's on a pretty regular basis I see them check that no party preference box. Mm-hmm. Maybe after hours and on weekends when I put my personal feelings hat back on, I can try to go get them to see the light of my political party. But I think it is a challenge and the responsibility of the top of the ticket candidates and the political parties themselves to do the successful outreach to convince new voters why they should affiliate themselves with this party versus that party. And you've seen that internal struggle and debate happening at the presidential contest, whether it's the Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders supporters duking it out for policy and what the platform might be for the party going forward. But the same on the Republican side, the Jeb Bushes, the Marco Rubios, the Donald Trumps, and the Ted Cruzes, trying to make sense of what is the Republican Party today and into the future, because it certainly isn't what it was in the past.
You oversee all the elections in all 58 counties here in California. Are the counties different in their technology, tabulation, and reporting, and is that a problem for the state?
Well, that's an understatement if I ever heard one. The good thing is California is a big state and a diverse state. And contrary to some perception out there, it's not the Secretary of State's office that conducts the election. Mm-hmm. Elections are conducted on a county-by-county basis with the Secretary of State and the state in general sort of overseeing, setting the policy, setting the parameters, and overseeing the proper conduct of elections. But I think the fact that there is a variance in how elections are complying with state law but conducted locally is a good thing, because every county is different. How do you reach out to voters, inform voters, and count ballots maybe in Los Angeles or Alameda counties is very different than, let's say Alpine County or Del Norte. So those regional nuances and difference, I think, are appropriate as long as they're all meeting the same standard of transparency, accountability, because there's nothing more fundamental than maintaining the integrity of our election. So our office tries to work in partnership with each and every registrar of voter in all the counties, all the local elections officials, to make sure that anybody who is eligible to register has unfettered access and an ability to do so. And so much to the point that we worked together on this new motor voter initiative last year that will systematically register eligible voters when they're at the DMV applying for or renewing a driver's license or a state ID. But we also work together in terms of putting out voter information leading up to an election and on all the protocols to ensure that every ballot is counted and accounted for, because nothing will undermine public confidence in government than if you think the elections aren't being conducted on the straight and narrow.
Mm-hmm. Here in Marin County, and I believe in most counties, the tabulation is done by a system called GEMS, G-E-M-S. And our viewers are familiar that they fill out their ballot and then they personally put it in the scanner that tabulates those votes and reports them to the central voters registrar office. A woman named Bev Harris, who's been analyzing elections for more than 15 years, Her website is Black Box Voting. She recently published a report saying that these GEMS tabulators can be programmed to count votes in fractions. And because we're a one-person, one-vote system, this seems to be way out of bounds, and it could, enable people to program that tabulator to count the vote in a predetermined way. Have you ever looked into this, and do you have any concerns about the accuracy and the security of our tabulation systems in California?
Yeah, look, happy to look into it. That's, again, one of the roles that we play when there's concerns or questions or even challenges to is this being done properly. We can look into it and help verify from a public confidence standpoint that things are done properly. I can tell you a couple of things. First, no equipment is used in elections in the state of California without having been certified either at the state or at the federal level. And part of that certification process is security. That's paramount in our election systems. So that's number one. The equipment that's used and how it is to be used in California has to be approved by state or federal officials. But in addition to that, all the more reason for why I'm a big fan of maintaining paper at some part of the process. I get asked on a pretty regular basis, am I a fan of or when will we see internet voting or online voting in California? Because we're home to Silicon Valley and tech is really changing every aspect of our daily lives. Why not elections? And I don't think we're ready for online voting or internet voting, both from a privacy standpoint as well as a security standpoint. Mm-hmm. And so as long as we have paper to go back to verify the accuracy of the results. If we need to count and recount however many times necessary to ensure the integrity of the results that we put out, that is the ultimate check for, did somebody hack a computer just to manipulate results because we can see it in that good old-fashioned way and verify. And the random auditing that's in place, we have all these measures to ensure the accuracy and the integrity of our elections so that people know that it's being done appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
When you were in the Senate, I'm switching gears. So let's leave this election. We'll find out what happens in 2 weeks or whenever. You chaired the Energy and Utilities Committee, and you worked on climate change issues that led to and helped pass AB 32. What's your assessment of how that's been working out, given the fact that the carbon credit auction didn't go all that well, and there's this big methane leak down at Porter Ranch? Right. Which sort of offsets all kinds of carbon reduction.
And affected me personally, if you haven't heard.
I haven't heard.
Yeah, we live in that neighborhood.
Oh, well, and your report. Well, how do you think AB 32 is turning out, and where do we go with climate change and carbon emissions here?
Right. Look, I think overall AB 32 is working, and it's working well. If nothing else, it's gotten not just California state officials, but local officials kind of focused on a goal here, focused on a target, and we're working towards not just compliance, but meeting and exceeding some of those targets. I think we're still just a decade into AB 32, but it will, in 20 years, 40 years looking back, I think we'll have shown a lot of success and influence other states as well as other nations to follow suit. When AB 32 was working its way through the legislature, it's the same year I was running for state senate. And believe it or not, as I was, phone banking, calling voters to ask for their support or knocking on doors, asking for voter support, they would ask me, what do you think of AB 32? And I would say a couple of things. First of all, it's a landmark legislation because for the first time we're setting these goals and objectives. But second, if it was to pass and be signed into law, which it was, then the real work would be in how we actually achieve those goals by 2020, by 2040, 2050, and beyond. And we weren't going to get there with technology and human behavior being what it was in 2006 and before. So what it's meant for policy and changes in the electricity sector, what it's meant for policy and changes in the construction sector, in the transportation sector, on and on and on, we've needed this very comprehensive plan so that sector by sector we can get those emission reductions and air quality improvements to meet the objectives of AB 32. The electricity sector alone, between energy efficiency requirements, renewable energy requirements, I think that we've made leaps and bounds gains overall, the gas leak in Porter Ranch, notwithstanding, that did set us back for this particular year. And as far as the auction, the cap and trade element of it, I think it had a very bad year. But it's only 1 year, one of the first years. So there's still time for it to have the effect that we hope for. But that's a beautiful thing about public policy. If it's not working out after a couple of years, you can go back and tweak it, go back and change it, try to improve upon it. And that's the job of this and future legislatures and governors.
I want to ask you about the Public Utilities Commission. I consider it a bit of a rogue agency. The scandals relate to the response to the San Bruno gas pipeline explosion and the cost sharing of the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear power plant. My view is that the governor left Michael Peavy as chair at least a year too long, if not more. Why is it, and also the governor vetoed a package of bills last year that were sensible reforms for the PUC. Why is it given such special treatment and a wide berth?
Yeah. Well, as a legislator, I can tell you one of the frustrating things that is a little bit of a harsh wake-up call for all legislators is to recognize the PUC as having, sort of a unique role and unique treatment in the state constitution. Similarly, a little different, but the UC enjoys that same sort of semi-autonomy, if you will. So a lot of other boards and commissions that are easier to reform, easier to influence. It's not quite the case with the PUC, which is unfortunate. I think it is time to revisit that. The Assembly considered a bill this year that would have put a measure on the ballot to redefine that independence of the PUC vis-a-vis the legislature, and I think that conversation should continue. I know when San Bruno happened, when San Onofre announced their closure after a many year history of safety questions, safety concerns there, and then more recently the Porter Ranch gas leak with SoCal Gas. I think that was the perfect storm that finally created the priority and the sense of urgency amongst legislatures to kind of revisit this relationship.
It's been great to talk with you today. Thanks for joining us, Secretary of State Alex Padilla.
Thank you.